All right, it looks like we're live. So, Dr. Bob Price, I'm not exactly sure what your position is on Jesus. So, could you tell me a little bit about when you say you don't believe there is a historical Jesus, what exactly would it mean for there to be a historical Jesus? How much of what is said in the New Testament would have to be true to qualify as a historical, quote, Jesus?
Well, I'd agree that if there was a historical Jesus, he would be something like what most mainstream critics say that he would have been. Uh, Perhaps an apocalyptic prophet predicting the soon coming end of the world. I don't think that a historical Jesus would have thought he was the Messiah for various reasons I can go into. Uh, or Jesus might have been a wandering sage like Diogenes, with the apocalyptic stuff added on later, like at the fall of Jerusalem, when everybody started thinking apocalyptically, the end is coming. But the one option for a historical Jesus that seems the most plausible to me is that of Robert Eisler, SGF Brandon, Robert Eisenman, and recent. Well, yeah, let's leave it at that. Though let me just mention that Valiant and Fahey's book Creating Christ, though they don't get into the question of whether there was a historical Jesus or not, I see that dovetailing with Brandon's work in his books, The Fall of Jerusalem and the Christian Church, I think that's the title, and another one he wrote called Jesus and the Zealots. Fahey and Valiant seem to me that they're not trying to lend a lot more weight to the speculations of Brandon that Jesus was a revolutionary, kind of like Theudas, the magician, um, uh, Simon Bar Giora, Menachem, and these other guys around the fall of Jerusalem. And that is my favorite, but any of those are plausible readings of the evidence, and it partly depends on what you think is authentic in the Gospels and what you think is a subsequent addition. Let's see. However, I don't really go along with any of them, though I'm more and more warmed up to the combined Valiant, Fahey, and Brandon idea of Jesus, the revolutionist who was sort of tamed and sanitized by Rome and its Christian allies. That makes a lot of sense to me. But I have to admit that my estimate of the gospel data is so negative, and this was over some years. It seems to me, for one thing, that virtually every story in the gospels can very easily be accounted for as a rewrite of Old Testament stories of the various heroes: David, Moses, Joshua, Elijah, and Elisha, especially. You can. I'd written a whole book about this, and nor am I the first one to point these things out. I was drawing on the work of a lot of different scholars who zeroed in on this or that and said, this looks like it's really too close to this or that Old Testament parallel. And if you look even closer, it kind of looks like here's how Mark or Matthew or whoever juggled the elements. Thomas L. Brody did a brilliant job with it. A lot of the Gospels, showing how a lot of it seems to be rewritten from the so-called Deuteronomic history, Joshua through Kings. And the sayings also, a lot of those are so parallel to rabbinic sayings and sayings of Cynic and Stoic philosophers of the era. Who are widely known, that you have the same problem Jacob Neusner points out with regard to the attribution of sayings to the rabbis in the Mishnah and the Talmud. Often the same saying will be attributed to two or three different people in different places. And Neusner says there's really no way to know who originally said this. It must not have been all of them who originated it. And I think that though Jesus could have, historical Jesus could have said many, many of these things, uh, what's left doesn't make him very distinctive, and it's hard to see how he would have become the fountainhead of a new religion. Just to beat this to death a little further, I think that the complete conformity of the gospel stories of Jesus to the mythic hero archetype that you see in loads of hero tales and biographical legends of founders like Moses and the Buddha and Zoroaster. The fact that you've got the whole thing pretty much, you've got a divine incarnation, a divine annunciation, a miraculous conception, signs in the heavens attending the birth of the messianic child. Sometimes the stories being very close. A dedication scene like Zoroaster coming up from the waters of the holy river and receiving the epiphany of the angel of Vohumana, who gives him his mission to preach the oneness of Ahura Mazda, whereupon he's tempted by Ahriman, the devil, to forsake his mission, but he won't do it. Paralleled also with the Buddha and Abraham and all that. Then you get into the child prodigy stories like Jesus in the temple with the elders holding his own with them, a story that's repeated with various other ones. Then you got miracles done, many of the same ones, described very similarly. Eventually, you have the crowd turning on the savior, and he's executed often on a hill for some reason, and then he comes back or ascends into heaven, and then makes appearances to his disciples, like Romulus telling the Romans to go conquer the world in his name, Jesus giving the Great Commission, etc., etc., and an ascension into heaven, being taken up and obscured by a cloud. This happens in various stories. Some of them that the gospel authors may well have known. I mean, they certainly seem to have known Josephus, who has an ascension of Moses and so forth. Some they needn't have known. It's more like what Martin de Bailius called the law of biographical analogy, that in the same sort of historical circumstance in the founding of a religion, you're going to hear again and again the same sort of stories told about the hero, the founder, in order to glorify him and underline the earth-shaking significance of his entering the historical stream. And it's no wonder that so many of these things sound so similar. Apollonius of Tyana and other ones, same thing. So and it seems to me there is nothing left. Like there are some characters about whom such stories are told: Caesar Augustus, Cyrus of Persia, and so on. And there's really no doubt that they existed, because we know enough else about them. We know they were tied in intimately and intricately to the events of their time, and their activities are attested by various sources, friendly and hostile. But none of that is true about Jesus. The gospel writers are not even sure how old he was or when he was born. Luke has implied two rival dates for the birth of Jesus, and John seems to imply Jesus was 50 when he was executed, whereas in Luke it's somewhere around 30, and on it goes. I just think the burden of proof is on the person that would say that there was a historical Jesus at the center of it. There might have been, but if so, he's lost to historical scrutiny, as far as I can tell. So that's a whole lot of gibberish, but it is a complicated question, and it seems to me like I'm an agnostic on it. I don't think we can know, and I think it would be foolish to go around saying, "Oh, brother, did you hear this? No historical Jesus, hallelujah!" They're absurd. Historians don't work like that. You have to make tentative, provisional conclusions, but maybe they're not conclusions, because it all, like in science, your current understanding must always be open to revision, and that's the way I am about this. And so I kind of juggle basically two paradigms for understanding the Jesus material in the Gospels. The one is that he's a mythic fictive creation analogous to other dying and rising gods in the Mediterranean world, or he did exist but was some kind of revolutionary character like several others we know of from the same period, and that in the process of sanitizing him, to pacifying him and his followers, he was embellished with all of these traditional miraculous elements. So if you're still awake, go ahead and ask
Yeah,
anything
so I
else.
technically I take the position that he's more of like a contemporary just figure, like you said, that was embellished to appease his followers mostly. Because if I think of it like the claim, if I told you I saw a dog, you'd probably believe me because there's lots and lots of dogs all the way. It's pretty common claim. And back then, having a claim of some guy who claimed to be a messiah with some magical powers that was then crucified by the Romans, I mean that happened every day. That's an everyday occurrence, like the claim I saw a dog. So from my perspective, someone like Tacitus taking the story of some Christians that he met, that there was this guy named Jesus. I mean, that's like, to me, that's equivalent to the claim I saw a dog. There was just some guy who claimed to be a Messiah, who had claimed to have magical powers, killed by the Romans. Oh, we had that last Tuesday, so there's pretty much no reason to doubt this at face value. So would you say that Jesus is somehow different from that kind of just everyday claim, since it was so common to have that?
It's sort of like Pilate says in Jesus Christ Superstar, you Jews produce messiahs by the sackful. And even if, I mean, I didn't even go into that other than to say there were other priestly and messianic revolutionaries, but the similarity to non-Jewish figures who were known in the day, like when Jesus says, "Let this cup pass from me." Is that the cup of poison that Socrates took? I mean, it sort of sounds like a literary allusion, and that alone wouldn't prove anything. But the fact that there's so much of this stuff, and on and on it goes. So yeah, there might have been a historical Jesus, I like to say, but there isn't anymore because we just can't know.
Right, and they just added all the stories in and just like zombified him and just put all the parts into this one story because it made them feel good. But to me, it seems like it's hard to say that there was a mythical Jesus because it was just so prevalent that the Jews had these messiahs. And so it would be like if I told you I saw a dog and you said, well, no, that was probably an imaginary dog. I mean, the burden of proof seems to be more on the claim that it was imaginary because the dog claim is just so prevalent. It's just the burden of proof is so low to just claim that there was this messianic Jew who was crucified by the Romans. Would you disagree with that?
A little bit. There's so much more to it, what they said about Jesus, for one thing, and things that sound very either like literary borrowings or mythic embellishments. Like you're not suggesting that it was every day that somebody was supposed to have walked on water or changed water into wine, though we have such stories about the Buddha and Dionysus and all that. So the fact that there are everyday claims, what day is every day? The thing like the claim, hey, I saw a dog in the neighborhood. Big deal. Why would anybody fabricate that? Well, the claims made about Jesus by the gospel writers and by apologists aren't recent reports. They're not. They're not tantamount to I saw a dog, or gee, it's December, but I saw an ice cream truck outside. Well, that could be. It's pretty weird, and it's so weird that you can well imagine if somebody saw it, they'd say, "Get a load of this." But this is like not anywhere near the alleged events. It's not someone's claim or report of anything. The very first time we meet it right out of the box, it's this huge, grand, mythic religious structure. And again, there were plenty of those, but they suffer from the same thing. They're not based on immediate reports either.
So how would Jesus be any different from most other historical figures? Because if you asked essentially most North Koreans about Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, they would essentially only be able to tell you those same kinds of allegorical stories about how he was born and the bird spoke and these kind of mythical stories. They probably don't know anything about his everyday life. So wouldn't the same be true of most historical figures from the perspective of most illiterate demographics of people?
Well, as um, I'm losing my senility. I'm gaining senility, losing my senses here. Collingwood, R.G. Collingwood, in his great book, The Idea of History, says that there is a history of propaganda for which propaganda is the fodder. It doesn't tell us about actual history because we can, especially since we can disprove a good bit of it, but it's not just worthless. It tells us something that people fabricated certain stories. And in North Korea, it's the cult of personality spawned by a propaganda machine. I mean, that's not even authentic legend. You've got a huge wall mural showing incredibly Kim Jong Un walking on the face of the sun, which apparently they wanted people to believe he did. Like, and of course, I guess they do because they'll get their head blown off if they don't in the nice peaceful regime of the Democratic Republic of Korea. Um, and in a sense, mythic propaganda like that, the only difference is it's true there what some critics of Christianity say wrongly, I think, that the whole thing was made up as a scheme, as propaganda, as if you had a bunch of TV writers getting together and saying, well, what kind of boffo thing can we come up with to get good ratings? That seems to me just it's possible, but I see no reason to think so. It just seems to me to be popular legend and scribal rewriting. Like a lot of these stories assume a pretty close familiarity with the Old Testament text, and people couldn't just go into their local Christian bookstore and buy a Bible. So who knew the text that well? Well, of course, it was scribes, Jewish and later Christians. So yeah, you do have some professionals working this stuff up, but it appears to have been a gradual thing, and I don't think there's any kind of the old thing, a hoax or history. I don't think there's any intent to deceive anybody. They're just creating edifying tales. The paramount example of this would be Peter walking on the water. The probably Jesus walking on the water is based either on the Odyssey, where Hermes walks on the water in similar circumstances, or in well, I think one of the Psalms, it speaks of Yahweh walking on the waves or some such thing. But what about what about Peter? Well, in Mark and John, of course, you do have Jesus walking on the water. Doesn't appear in Luke, but in Matthew, it's pretty much the same until the disciples' reaction. In the other Gospels, the disciples say, "Oh my God, it's a ghost," and Jesus says, "No, no, no, it's me. Don't worry." And he gets into the boat. But in Matthew, there's a bit of a detour because uh, Peter isn't just skeptical. It's a ghost, like everybody screams in ghost movies and the like. He says, "Lord, if it is you, have me walk on the water to join you." And I've always wondered, how is that an answer? But I think I got it. I think he says, "Well, I know I'm not a ghost. If you can somehow uphold me on the water, then I guess it's you're doing the same with yourself. However it is." Well, and then he does, but then he becomes like Wile E. Coyote in a Warner Brothers cartoon. He suddenly notices, hey, I'm defying gravity here. Whoops, and down he begins to go. And Jesus says, what happened to your faith? Why did you doubt? Yeah, yeah. Why would you doubt if you're suddenly walking on water, right? Anyway, the what is going on? Why did Matthew add that, which he plainly did? I mean, if that was the original story, there is no way either Mark or John, much less both of them, would have omitted it. Why were they just running out of ink and so I better wrap this thing up? That's ridiculous. Well, it's obvious what Matthew was doing. He saw this as like an allegory for the Christian life. Friend, you may be going through difficult times. The waves of trouble may be going up around you at this very moment, but don't sink. You keep your eyes on Jesus, and you'll stay above those problems. Of course, that's brilliant. It's a great piece of exhortation and so on. And I'd be willing to bet my life that anyone who has ever preached a sermon on that story made that point, and they're right. Certainly, that's what I meant. Was Matthew thinking, "Boy, these suckers, these rubes, I'm gonna trick them all"? Of course not. I mean, there were quacks and frauds in the ancient world, but this doesn't do you any good. I mean, it's an edifying story. Who knows if the evangelist Matthew, whoever he really was, thought people would believe it literally, because that wasn't exactly the point. The point is that Christ will save you even if you begin to doubt. And so it just seems to me the kind of stuff we have, it's easy to account for, and to show that it's not historical fact isn't even violating the intention of it, possibly. I know I've gone far afield from what you
Right.
had.
Well, Tacitus said that the Christians made up the story about how the Christus was persecuted by Pontius Pilate. But do you think that Tacitus thought that the Jesus was a myth, or do you think he was just a guy who could have existed just like one of those other messianic people killed by the Romans? What do you think?
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
What do you think Tacitus' position on this would be, on the mysticist position?
Well, if he actually wrote the celebrated paragraph, and I'm willing to assume he did, though there are real arguments against it. But if he did write it, it sounds like he just took Jesus. Well, he doesn't even use the name Jesus, but Christus, or some manuscripts have Crestus, that he took this to be another guy like Theudas the magician or Judas of Galilee. He says, "Oh, Christians, oh, you know who I mean, don't you? The sect that was founded by this guy." He doesn't make any claim of miracles. I think he does say that, well, no, it's Josephus who says his disciples, those who loved him from the first, never abandoned him, but said that he appeared to some of them 3 days later. I don't think Tacitus even says anything like that. He says, "Oh yeah, he was the founder of these Christians." So,
Yeah, well, that's where I get my analogy from, of like the claim "I saw a dog," because it seems like that's just the history of the time was just rife with these examples. That it seemed like you could just take it at face value that this Christ guy existed and he was just one of those Jews that was just killed. So it seems comparable to me to the claim like, "I saw a dog, I saw a Christian guy who was crucified by the Romans." Like, yeah, okay.
could be. On the other hand, he's writing nearly 100 years after this supposedly happened, and most likely, seems to me, he's simply reporting some version of what contemporary Christians in Rome were saying, and so we don't know how. Like, he doesn't say anything, any of the big stuff that Christians said, but of course he's not going to say that even if he knows it, given the subject matter. Oh, talking about Nero burning down Rome, blaming it on the Christians. Who are they? Well, the guy Christus founded it. He's not going to say, and interestingly, he walked on water, changed water into wine, ascended into heaven, and all that. So even if he knew they said that, he's not going to get into that at the moment. So it's very hard. I mean, this is the kind of picky, endless ambiguity you find in all these historic reports that really make it almost impossible to know what the heck happened. And I think of today with mundane events that this whole thing that Donald Trump was colluding with Vladimir Putin. There's no evidence for this at all, but there was a propaganda legend created to discredit Trump, and this is going on all the time. I remember back in I guess the early '90s. Do you remember what the heck was? There was some babysitter who I can't think of her name, but the Long Island Lolita, they called her, and she apparently tried to kill the husband of the guy she was dating, and all that. Well, right around the same time, the three big non-cable networks put out docudramas about this, and they all differed. I mean, whatever happened had happened only months before, and it was impossible already to tell what happened. And same thing here, it seems to me.
Oh, do you think that it would be more likely that that it would be easier for Christianity to build early followers if there was really a guy behind it as opposed to it being a fictitious character?
Not necessarily, because that uh, I hate when people say beg the question in this sense. I guess it's appropriate. That sort of presupposes the answer to a prior question. How did people wind up joining this religion? Uh, it's very difficult to say what the early Jewish Christians were thinking, because of course the war with Rome wiped out a whole lot of them. We don't know what they could have told us. The people in the Mediterranean world and Asia Minor and all that, if the Pauline epistles are anything to go by, nobody was talking about any life of a historical Jesus anyway. They were talking about somebody that sounds very much like a mystery religion deity: Mithras, Attis, Adonis, Osiris, Dionysus, and so on. All they knew, as far as we can tell, was that I can have eternal life if I join myself to the dying and rising of the Savior called Jesus, which happens to mean Savior anyway. And so I'm going to do it. And eventually people started telling stories about what Jesus was supposed to have done, perhaps to fill the gap. Which would have been very analogous, by the way, to the kind of whoppers you read in the infancy gospels of Thomas, of pseudo Matthew, of the Arabic infancy gospels, and so on, where early Christian curiosity couldn't rest when it came to what was Jesus doing as a kid. And so they just used their pious imagination to fill it in, and it happened fast once the question arose. It seems to me the same kind of thing probably happened with the New Testament Gospels. What would this guy have done while he was on Earth? Originally, it didn't matter any more than what Mithras might have been doing before he killed the cosmic bull to save everybody. Just wasn't relevant, so who cared?
When I think about contemporary examples of people who are followed as religious leaders, like Jonathan Smith of Mormonism, and the guy who created Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, or
Mm,
the Russian guy Vissarion, there always seems to be some body behind the curtain, to use your analogy from the Bart Ehrman debate. There always seems to be
mm.
some charismatic character that really caused people to follow this ideology. So to me, it seems like without that charismatic personality to guide it, even if it wasn't Jesus, it must have been somebody like Paul or Peter or somebody, then it wouldn't have really gained as much popularity. So to me, it seems it must have had some kind of really charismatic person behind it.
Oh, there must have been such people that spread the gospel. It's just a question of, did Jesus start the ball rolling? Well, I mean, because there's a major theory that more liberal scholars have always held, that Jesus did exist, but really the Christianity was founded by Paul. If you get to that point and think that's plausible, it's like it doesn't really matter if there was a Jesus. And there may have been. I mean, there's nothing implausible about that. I'm just saying all the supposed evidence seems either like literary rewrites or misattributed sayings, or the mythic hero archetype. It's like there's nothing left. Like, again, Augustus, his biography fits some of those things. He was the savior, he was the son of God, he brought peace on earth. The news of his birth was the beginning of the gospel, the same Greek phrase in the beginning of Mark, and so on. And we know he existed because you wouldn't have had all this history without him. But you just don't have Jesus connected to history in that way. Even the stories that seem to do that in the Gospels, where he's connected with Pontius Pilate, with Caiaphas, with Herod the Great, and all that, Scholars for generations have seen these stories as likely fictitious, and people that never even thought about Jesus not having existed. Just looking at these stories, they said, wait a minute, Pontius Pilate, a Jew hating bigot who outraged Jews every chance he got, he's going to let a bunch of pool hall rowdies in an alley bully him into letting go a guy he is convicted as a terrorist and let Barabbas go? Come on. That's just not possible. And the stuff we know about Pilate, we know from other sources, Philo and Josephus and all that. So that one's virtually impossible. Or Herod the Great, he kills all the kids in Bethlehem to get rid of Jesus. This sounds so much like the slaughter of the innocents connected with the birth of Moses, not only in Exodus, but even more in Josephus's rewrite of the Exodus story. So yeah, Herod the Great was a paranoid maniac. You can imagine him doing this. Maybe he did, but there's no record of it, though many other atrocities committed by him are recorded. And it's so much like this well-known biblical story, you really have to say, I'm not so sure. Or Caiaphas, the high priest of Israel, he is having a legal hearing with Jesus on Passover Eve. This is like the Pope skipping the Christmas Eve or the Easter Mass, saying, I gotta go down to the dry cleaner. I'm sorry, you guys will have to take it. It's impossible. And so one of, like, with no connection to a theory that Jesus didn't exist, these things fall away one by one. And so again, I say, where was this Jesus? Where was his footprint on history? We can say about the theological Christ. Oh, well, yeah, there's a huge footprint there, but that's not quite the point we're making. And I said to Bart that if you come up with a modest historical Jesus that would not have been significant enough for Josephus and others to record him, why did Christians make a big deal out of him? It's like deciding you want to discover the historical Superman and finding out that, well, there was a Clark Kent who was employed by the Daily Planet. So we've got the historical Superman. No, you don't. You have a historical Clark Kent, and that is quite different. And so there's a lot of slipshod argumentation, I think, though there may have been a Jesus, and all it would take to convince me would be if we had one of the many, many old papyrus letters from that period where somebody just happened to mention that they had seen the famous Jesus of Nazareth during a visit to Jerusalem or something. That's all it would take. I mean, that's not any kind of propaganda. If we had only that, I would say, okay, that's it. Forget the mythicism thing. I don't care one way or the other. It does not have an impact on me, though it's a fascinating question.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think that's why I'm interested in the topic, is because it is a very fascinating question. So, but to go back to your point of why would they be interested in this Clark Kent character? I mean, most of the people that people are revered today, they're just like the Clark Kent. It's just people are deluded into thinking they're the Superman character, and they attribute all these weird stories to them. Like I'm one of several of your debates. I've heard you talk about how Charles Manson was claimed like he could lift a bus over a gorge or something, and that there was these claimed miracles of all these essentially just average dudes just because they're charismatic. And so it seems like most people tend to aggregate towards these just Clark Kent characters who they are deluded into believing they're the Superman characters. So I'm not too surprised at the fact that even if there was a historical Jesus in the Clark Kent kind of a sense, that was embellished to be the Superman character, and that was followed.
Why would anybody have done that with good old Clark, a bumbling but a reporter, probably a coward, everybody thought, but a good writer? Why would they have done that? And if you're going to say, you might say, well, I bet he got the Pulitzer Prize. So let's say he did, but how much farther could you go? You can well imagine people telling stories about Batman, that, oh, he flies through the air and he sucks people's blood. I mean, that would be not much of a big jump, but it wouldn't be like changing Bruce Wayne into Batman. It would be changing Batman into Superman, and he's already like the charismatic, dynamic figure, but just some guy. And with Manson, of course, his followers claimed to have seen this kind of stuff, and there were drugged out zombies who were all sleeping with him and stuff. You know, they're I wouldn't trust anything they said, even if it was just asking them what time it was. So that's not the typical case either. But there certainly have been cult leaders and like Jim Jones and Reverend Moon and so on. Jesus could have been one, but I don't think there's enough evidence even to say that. It could have been, though. I mean, I don't know otherwise.
I also had a question about your the mysticist interpretation of the crucifixion, where there was the what's it? It's in like the firmament with the argons or something.
Archons.
Archons.
Yeah.
That's it. So what is?
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, this would fit very old mythology, which nonetheless continued to pop up, like in Zoroastrianism, uh, and uh, and in the Rig Veda, where the primal man, who appears to be another version of what we later read called the Son of Man in heaven, at the right hand of the Ancient of Days, he sacrifices himself in the heavens, and from his sundered form everything is created. It's also a lot like Philo Judaeus, who says that the Logos was the heavenly Adam, emanated from God, and he was a vast human form, and he was the pattern for the creation of the world and humanity, and so on. And I think that. That the mythicist thing about the crucifixion represents a historicization of the Gnostic creation myth, which held that, again, one of these emanations from the Godhead, whom some called the Christ or some the man or whatever, uh, he was a being of spiritual light who was ambushed by the vicious archons, who were sort of fallen angel figures. The demiurge, their boss, who was a kind of a dimwit semi divinity, he had created the world out of matter, but it was just swamp, just motionless bunch of gunk. And so the archons went out and ambushed the primal man of light, ripped him apart, and used to use a modern term, photons that made him up as a kind of self-replicating DNA. I wish the ancients had these modern things. They're great analogies. And they used it to give life to the mud pie creation of the demiurge. And they tied that in with God breathing the spirit of life into Adam in the garden and all that. They said that's what was happening. And that got the human race and all other life going. So the death of the primal man, the Son of Man character, gave life to the world. And then they, in some vague way, they said that the primal man had returned in recent days as the Gnostic revealer, kind of like Morpheus in the Matrix, which is overtly based on Gnosticism, to awaken the sparks within those who had them, and to say, you know, you don't really belong here. You're a stranger in a strange land. I can tell you how to get back there. You won't have to be reincarnated tears anymore. Once you realize you have a divine origin and destiny, you, upon death, you will just ascend to the pleroma, the fullness of light, to be with God. And so they kind of eventually seem to merge the primal man of light with the Gnostic revealer and historicized it. But originally, it was the principalities and powers that put him to death on the cross, as in Colossians, or it was the archons of this age who saw to his death, as in First Corinthians. And no political background or historical detail is even suggested in the Pauline epistles, but it gets historicized. Oh, this happened on earth. Well, then who would have engineered it? I guess it would have been the human rulers of this world. So to me, that is not problematical at all. And there's a mythicist. I mean, I don't think that's more provable than that it happened historically. But if you're asking in mythicist terms, how do you get the crucifixion? Well, that's how. It's not very difficult to see.
So these are mutually exclusive kinds of things. It's not like you have the crucifixion on earth and then also the crucifixion in heaven. They're contradictory.
Yeah, though their Gnosticism was the many-headed Hydra, and there were different versions of it. In Valentinian Gnosticism, the most successful form, they said that that Jesus was the human flesh and blood man who acted as the channeler, as we would say, for the Christ Spirit, who was one of the emanations from the Godhead. So the Christ did not die on the cross. And there were Gnostic texts that where people thought he did, but it was like a hologram. That's such a fools think that he died. But Valentinus said, no, Jesus, the man, did die on the cross. And for those who don't have the divine spark, those who aren't saved by nature, if they have faith in the crucified Christ, God is willing to save them too. So he had two Christs, sort of like Nestorianism much later. So there were a lot of different versions of it, but some Gnostics thought no. It's like did you ever see The Last Temptation of Christ?
Yep.
When the angel lets him down from the cross, the people on the ground are still shaking their fists and cursing at who? We can see there's no one there, but they're having a hallucination. Well, that's kind of what some Gnostics thought. Well, Hebrews comes kind of close to what you're suggesting because the way I read it, and most people do. Jesus did die on the cross physically. I mean, Earl Doherty thinks that Hebrews doesn't even picture a historical Jesus. He might be right. I sort of don't think so, but I'm sorry. Anyway, Hebrews says Jesus died on the cross physically, but then his saving work really happens in the heavenly tabernacle, not on earth. He presents his own shed blood as the atonement for the people down below. So you almost do have the saving work done in heaven and also on earth.
So what happened to the early Gnostics who believed this? Like, and what were they like? Would you suggest that Peter and Paul had this kind of Gnostic belief, or who believed this, and what happened to them? How did there become a change to the more modern view of the human Christ crucified on the cross by Pontius Pilate?
Well, that's part of the big question of how, if Jesus was originally a mythic deity, how do you get historicized? Period. I mean, the whole shooting match, and the answer to that, I think, that was supplied over 100 years ago by Arthur Drews. It looks like in English pronunciation, I think it's Drefts, though. Arthur Drefts, a Dutchman. In a couple of books he did, The Christ Myth and so on, he said it's pretty simple. There was a big competition between all these versions of Christianity. And of course, nobody doubts that, whether even in the New Testament period or for a couple of centuries. We've got all kinds of material about that. People began to posit that they had the truth about Christianity right from the horse's mouth, that their leaders a few generations back had been taught by a historical founder, and they transmitted it. And so if you want to know what Christianity is about, listen to them. I mean, that's very clearly stated by Irenaeus in his book Against Heresies. But Gnostics began to do the same thing. Valentinus claimed that he got his teaching from Theodos, a disciple of Paul, and Basilides claimed he was taught by Glaucias, a disciple of Peter. Are they right? I have no idea. But the idea was in mythicism that you were trying to say, look, shake the hand that shook the hand. We heard him say it. You Gnostics can hallucinate all you want. Oh, Jesus appeared to me and said communion should be done with pizza from now on. Or Jesus told me there's life on Mars. Hallelujah. And Irenaeus said, you go ahead with your game of can you top this? All of it's subjective hallucination. You're just winging it. We don't have that problem because our guys were taught by Jesus when he was on earth. This comes up explicitly in the pseudo-Clementine romances, these novels about Peter and Clement and all that, where Peter has a showdown with Simon Magus. And Simon says, you guys don't understand Jesus correctly. He really stands for Marcion. He says, I do, however, because the risen Jesus appeared to me and set me straight. You guys are all wrong, and I'll show you how. And they said, look, pal, if you were really an authoritative teacher about Christianity, you'd agree with us because we knew the guy. We know what he said. You're just making it up. And so that created the need to have a supposedly authentic historical source, our founder, because otherwise anybody can say anything they wanted, let 100 flowers bloom. I mean, we have definite evidence of that happening. So I think Drops was right. The whole thing was a matter of an authority struggle. Let's avoid subjectivity and believe what we say. Of course, since some Gnostics are saying the same thing, it amounted to a kind of a leap in the dark as to who you're going to believe anyway.
So up till that point, before this power struggle settled kind of on the historical Jesus side, what do you think most Christians at that time really believed, or did they really not care one way or the other?
I suspect that before this started, people, Christians, didn't really care much about it. They still don't. I mean, if you bring up the question, they'll say, oh, well, of course, Jesus existed as a historical individual, but that's not what's important about Jesus. For them, it's still, I mean, you're about to hear this on Good Friday and Easter, that he's a mystery religion deity. He came from heaven, he died for us, he rose from the dead, and we can appropriate that through faith and the sacraments. As Kierkegaard said, if all we knew about Jesus was that he came and died and rose from the dead, that'd be enough. And that's what the Nicene Creed says. There's nothing about, oh, Jesus taught in parables. No. So I think that's still all that really matters. I know there are people who say, what would Jesus do and all that, but that's not the essence of Christianity for people. Now, there was a compromised position, I believe, between a mythic Jesus and historical Jesus. And that was this view I already mentioned, docetism, that many Gnostics upheld, from dokeo, to seem or appear. And the idea was, well, people did see or thought they saw Jesus walking around teaching and all that, but it was really just a projection, a kind of a hologram. And the Acts of John could not be more explicit. John tells his followers years on, he says, let me tell you some of the stories about the good old days with Jesus. I used to notice that if I reached out to pat him on the shoulder, sometimes my hand would go right through as if he was a ghost. But then other times I'd have to rub my knuckles because it was like striking Superman, or it was like steel, he said. I would notice when we were walking on the Sea of Galilee, the shore, he left no footprints. I noticed that when we were sitting next to each other at the table, he would never eat. What's this? And so he says, yeah, Jesus just had the appearance. He wasn't really a flesh and blood character. My theory is that that was a way of splitting the difference between there was never a Jesus who lived on earth and saying, oh, yeah, there was, and he was, okay, miraculously born, but a flesh and blood human like us. This is kind of a compromised position, and a lot of people believe that. And in effect, they still do. Ask devout Christians, do you think Jesus ever had to go to the bathroom? Could Jesus have starved to death? If Jesus was hammering a nail in the carpenter shop and hit his thumb, would he have started cussing? Schleiermacher, the great father of liberal theology, he was still haunted by stuff like this. He believed Jesus had to have been a flesh and blood human, but he said that being perfect, Jesus could never have made a mistake on a math problem. He could learn, but not by trial and error because he couldn't make errors. Somebody that says this is a kind of like Ernst Käsemann said, a naive docetist. Remember in John chapter 4, the Jesus is tired of sitting by the well. Disciples go on into some supermarket. Couldn't very well have been the Piggly Wiggly, that's for sure. But let's say the Food Lion of Judah, maybe. And he's there, and this woman's dipping the bucket in the well, and Jesus said, would you mind if I had a drink? She said, hey, look, nothing doing. You know as well as I do, Jews can't use the same dishes that Samaritans do. They hated each other so much. And then et cetera, et cetera. And the disciples come back with the bags full of bologna sandwiches and stuff, and they say, here, master, eat. And it's not, no thanks, maybe next time. I have food to eat that you know nothing about. For my nourishment is to do the will of my Father. Wait a minute, Jesus doesn't need to eat? Or he's on the cross and says, I thirst. Okay, there, he's really human, right? No, it says simply in order to fulfill scripture. He said, I thirst, because a line quoted out of one of the Psalms. And so it's a lot of people today, and even when you don't expect it, in the New Testament you've got, or in Pauline epistles, he assumed the form of a servant, the likeness of mankind. Why don't you just say he became a man? Why this distancing language? So a lot of people may have believed in docetism, if not mythicism, and my guess is docetism was a sort of a mutation of mythicism.
But there are other stories they make up in order to account for certain things, like the fact that it was Jesus of Nazareth, and the fact that he was born in Nazareth. And they created this entire elaborate nonsense of a census that people were forced to go back to their homeland. Now, that doesn't make any sense at all. And that seems whoever created that story totally undermines their credibility if they're trying to argue that they're a credible source of knowing what Jesus was like, because he was supposed to be born in the house of David, which was Bethlehem. So wouldn't it make more sense that if they made up this story to try and accommodate someone who they were already worshiping, like a real guy who was actually from Nazareth?
I've Christopher Hitchens said that, and I'm constantly hearing that on the Bible Geek, but I don't see it because it presupposes that you've already come to believe that there was a historical Jesus who was the Jewish Messiah. And I mean, Christianity wasn't just a room with 12 guys. These stories weren't necessarily told at the beginning, and all one would need to say was that some Christians said, well, if Jesus was the Messiah, where was he born? Well, how about Bethlehem? What's it, in Amos? I think it says, you, O Bethlehem, though least among the clans of Judah, from you will come forth for me one who is ancient of days, etc. And it mentions Jerusalem, the house. I mean, Bethlehem, city of David, right? Well, some said, well, if he's talking about the Messiah, which I'm not so sure of, but let's say he was, they thought so. They said that settles it. Jesus must have been born in Bethlehem. But there were others that said, He was called Jesus the Nazarene. What would that mean? Well, I guess he was from Nazareth, but of course it need not mean that. There was a pre-Christian Jewish sect of wandering carpenters and ultra pious Jews called the Nazareans, which means the keepers, apparently the keepers of the Torah or whatever. And they were still around in the first couple of centuries of Christianity. I think it's Epiphanius of Salamis who mentions them. Well, that could have been, somebody could have thought for whatever reason that Jesus was a member of that sect. But after a while, people said, I don't think Jesus would have needed to learn anything from anybody. No, it must mean something else. And though we have no real archaeological evidence that there was a Nazareth in the first third of the first century, it's very strange. Many, many Jewish towns are named in Josephus and the Talmud, but not this one. Um, they rebuilt Nazareth about the middle of the first century AD. Now, it had been settled on and off for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it wasn't settled at the time Jesus was supposedly around, as far as we can tell, but it was later. So by the time the Gospels were written, there was a Nazareth again. And so people began to say, I bet it means he was from Nazareth. But wait a minute. Um, isn't he? What about the Bethlehem thing? They had heard of that. And so both Matthew and Luke see this as a problem. Like you mentioned, the implausibility of Luke's version, where, well, maybe Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth, but they got this notice in the mail that everybody had to go out for a Roman taxation census to the place their ancestors lived 1,000 years before. They're not going to do that. Nobody's ever done that. They want to go where you live so they'll know where to send the IRS. And what do you know? Mary gave birth while they were up there for the census, and then they went home to Nazareth. Well, that didn't occur to Matthew's. It was absurd. And he said, no, no, no. Mary and Joseph lived in Bethlehem. Their son was born there. And as much as 2 years later, these Zoroastrian magi, astrologers, came and asked Herod, hey, congratulations, new king, your successor, I presume, was just born. Can we see him? Well, what are you talking about? There's no king born. Well, where's he supposed to be born? Oh, and the scribes tell him Bethlehem. And of course, kind of makes you wonder why the star didn't lead them there immediately. You know, why they have to go and anyway, so they go there and they find Jesus, you know, the rest of the story. Then an angel says, look, you better get out of here, go to Egypt, they'll never find you there. And they do. And then after Herod kicks the bucket, the angel says, okay, coast is clear now, go on back. And they're about to. And then the angel says, oh, oops, I just heard Archelaus is on the throne. He's worse than his dad. Don't go back to Bethlehem. Why don't you go way up north to Nazareth? Yeah, that's the ticket. Like, there is no way to get these two together. It's just that they both have in common, we got a Jesus of Nazareth who must have been born in Bethlehem. Why wasn't he called Jesus of Bethlehem? They just have diametrically opposite answers to the question, and neither one of them really holds water. But
Well, you said
neither demands a historical Jesus either. Go ahead.
well, you said that your account of how he came to be known as a Nazarene was just somebody thought he was might have been related to the Nazarenes. Is that really a plausible thing that people would a conclusion they would really draw?
Well, according to this, they might have. I mean, that's no different than saying, for whatever reason, that he was baptized by John, who was a similar sort of a sectarian. Why would they have said that? Well, if there was no Jesus, well, that would be if John the Baptist was a real historical figure, venerated as much as that Josephus passage said, it might well have been a credential for Jesus to have been a protege of John the Baptist, and the same might be true here if these guys were well-known pious ascetics. And if you said, well, Jesus was one of those, that would have been a great credential. What was he doing all that time? Well, he was with these Bible studying carpenters, hint, hint. So it's not that hard to imagine, but that gets reinterpreted. And there's an exact parallel in Buddhism, where in earlier versions of the story, after Prince Siddhartha renounces his wealth, he wants to seek the key to liberation. And first, he studies with two different ascetic sages. He finds their teaching unsatisfactory and then goes and sits beneath the Bodhi tree and is enlightened. Well, in later retellings of the story, they cut out the two teachers. And I think that's the same kind of thing, that for somebody, it was a mark of distinction for Jesus to have been associated with the Nazarene sect. But later on, when the Christology rose and they said, oh, he wouldn't have needed that. That would have been a charade. So to heck with that, maybe Nazarene means something else.
Oh, that's interesting. Because
Who knows, though? It's all speculation.
yeah, because I mean, they did say that Jesus, when he was a kid, you brought up the story about him arguing with the scholars and things. So it seems like he would have meaningful interactions with them. He could have been a part of the group in that kind of a sense, where he was elected as a young kid just because he was so knowledgeable. So couldn't they also have made a case that he was, in fact, that he would have benefited by being part of this group, and instead of making up all of this stuff about the consensus, they could have just said, yeah, he was actually a part of this Nazarene group, and it didn't mean he was born there. Wouldn't that make more sense, and then say he was actually from Bethlehem, than arguing for this whole consensus line of reasoning?
Well, it's just that different Christians believe different things. You can see even in the Gospels, like when Jesus in Mark denies that the Messiah is even supposed to be a descendant of David. Well, in other parts of the Gospels, people say, oh, help me, son of David. Not everybody believed the same thing. And so luckily, these things are preserved. You have the same thing in Genesis. When did people start addressing the deity as Yahweh or Jehovah? Well, according to chapter 4 or 5, it says in the days of Enosh, people began to call upon the name of Yahweh. But then in Exodus 3, I guess it is, Moses encounters God in the burning bush, and he says, well, who am I to tell the Israelites sent me? And he says, tell them that Yahweh did. I am that I am. Tell them I am has sent you. Tell them Yahweh, which is a pun, sent you. Well, which way was it? I mean, Enosh must have at one point been understood to be the first man. Again, the different groups had different first men. Adam or Enosh, both of them kind of mean man. And so some people said, well, as soon as he was created, man was told to call him the name of his creator. But somebody else said, oh, no, that had no idea of that story. And so, well, it must have been with Moses. He really started the Jewish revelation. There's just no way to harmonize it. And lucky for us, the Bible editors usually didn't try. They just preserved what they found and made a kind of a scrapbook of it.
Could you explain to me more about your methodology? Because you disagree with like Bart Ehrman and most of the academic consensus about certain passages, like the Gnostics, where Bart Ehrman says that the Gnostics, we don't really know anything about them, and they probably came in the 2nd century, whereas you interpret them as coming earlier. And there are a lot of passages you interpret as being interpolations that they seem to disagree on. Can you explain to me how your methodology works to come to those conclusions, and could we apply those to lots of other historical characters as well?
Oh, yeah, you sure can. And it's been done. Like, what's his name? E.J. something Thomas wrote this great book, The Life of Buddha as Legend and History. He does the same thing, showing the inconsistencies between the stories and the teachings and peeling back the layers and saying this must be the later one, this must be the earlier one. With the interpolations, Bart, like a lot of anti-mythicists, say, you're just in a tight spot. You're trying to get out of it. You say that Paul knew nothing about the life of Jesus. What about this, that, and the other thing? Well, as I said in the debate, which nobody seemed to hear, all of these passages were tagged as interpolations by non-mythicists who weren't even talking or thinking about it. No, it was because, gee, this doesn't have the standard Pauline vocabulary, or this seems to interrupt the flow of the argument, and this seems to use anachronistic stuff. Or what my favorite, in Galatians 1, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman and born under law. Do you usually go out of your way to say that, oh, one thing about President Trump, he was born of a human mother? Does anybody doubt that? Well, in the case of Jesus, you bet they did. The Marcionites said Jesus descended directly from heaven as an adult and went right to the synagogue in Capernaum. Yeah, it seems to me that that is an interpolation to try to have Paul undercut the claims of Marcionites, who were Paul's biggest fans. And a bunch of things like this. The Last Supper thing in 1 Corinthians 10 or 11, wherever it is, this doesn't seem to fit the context. It's like zigzagging, and often that's the case. We don't have any trouble seeing this in the Gospels. Everybody for generations has known that, yeah, these things are patchwork quilts. They recorded all these different sayings and stories, and sometimes grouped them by subject, sometimes maybe chronologically. The same sort of seams appear, redactional seams, as they say, appear in the epistles, where this, like, oh my God, First Corinthians, what a playground for this kind of thing. In one chapter, you have it said that it's okay to eat food previously sacrificed to idols. If it's given somebody else trouble, don't do it, but inherently there's nothing wrong with it. In the very next chapter, it says, hey, don't be like the Israelites who joined in the feast of one of the Baals, and God killed 20,000 of them for it. Don't take the same risk. Wait a minute. It does. You can't eat from the table of Christ and the table of demons. I thought it didn't make any difference. Or can women speak in church? According to chapter 14, let them keep quiet and ask their husband questions when they get home. But in chapter 7, oh no, there are prophetesses who can speak to the assembly as long as they're veiled. Which is it? And so on and so on. It just seems like, as the Dutch radicals pointed out, Van Manen and others, that we have people continuing to add material to correct it. Like they don't agree with what it said, and so they say, well, I'll undermine that by having Paul say this. I mean, we have this all over the place in the Upanishads. There's no debate about that. People kept adding incompatible materials so that it's impossible to systematize any one of them. Same thing here, it seems to me. You either have to have Paul as a multiple personality, or who changed every time he picked up the pen, or several different writers were involved in this, and these. William O. Walker Jr. and Winsome Monroe both have great books on interpolations in the Pauline epistles, and they lay out a long list of textual and stylistic ways you can detect these things. Why is there so much reluctance to recognize that there may well have been interpolations? Well, because we don't have any copies of these letters or any New Testament books before the Chester Beatty Papyri around 200 AD. And there's no way to know what might have been added. And that's the period in which they would have been added. So who knows? And why don't they agree with this? Well, as a couple of these scholars have actually said, if we admitted that, if we supposed that there were a bunch of interpolations, we'd never know what Paul really wrote. And we kind of need to know that. We need to write books on Pauline theology. Well, forget that if we can't know if he wrote the whole thing. So we have to assume that he did. And that is a strange phenomenon, whereby what ought to lead to agnosticism, who knows, leads instead to fideism. let's just assume that it's all kosher because otherwise we can't play the game. So that's one reason. And it's kind of like a more sophisticated version of the fundamentalists that say the King James Bible is the only word of God. Look, you got to admit it. Maybe you can't play the game. And Bart also, I believe, having studied under Bruce Metzger, who I did too very briefly one summer, a saintly man, a great scholar. He's a textual critic, as is Bart. And Metzger was a fundamentalist religiously, and so was Bart. And he's gradually emerged from that, and he's still emerging from it. He used to believe the empty tomb narrative was historical, not anymore. I don't know where he's going to end up, but he's really a textual critic. His knowledge of all the rest of it is secondary, though he has a wide knowledge of it. But I think he really is not sufficiently critical, a historical critic. I did a thing in my book. Bart Ehrman Interpreted, where I just went over a lot of the verses that he cites to say, you see, Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. And I showed that, well, for one reason, there's serious reason to doubt that any Jesus said this, even if there was one. And secondly, even if he did, it's not at all clear that these things are about the end of the world. He's reading in, I think, the stuff that he learned in seminary. He's still, that's why in one of my chapters in that book was called Agnostic Apologist, is he's still arguing that kind of, from that sort of framework. I think you asked something else about methodology, not just with the interpolations, but do you remember? Maybe you're,
Well, yeah, I was asking, could you tell me more about your methodology? Just for clarification, could you define an interpolation that's like an addition or reinterpretation of something from a later or a different source?
yeah, like a scribe has added something into the text, often because, I mean, there's some cases where nobody doubts this happened, and not only in the Bible, where like the one of the,
Well, one of them would be like when Jesus knelt down and wrote in the sand, "He who is without sin will cast the first stone."
that's right, yeah, that whole story, the woman taken in adultery, doesn't occur in the earliest copies of John, and we start seeing it in a couple of different places in different manuscripts of John, or in Luke. So it seems obvious that people liked this story, but it hadn't made it into any gospel. And so independently, two or three scribes said, well, it's too good to lose. Let's anchor it in there. Or an even more outrageous example would be, I think it's in chapter 5, the guy who's at the portico of the pool of Bethesda, and he remains there lame on the ground week after week, and Jesus is aware of this, and he says to the guy, do you even want to be healed? And he says, well, you see, it's a catch 22. The reason it was a healing shrine was the water would bubble occasionally, apparently from some underground gas or something, but they believed that an angel had come down and stirred up the water, and first one into the pool gets healed. And he says, of course, my affliction is I can't jump up and run in there. And so Jesus says, oh, you don't need to. Here, you're healed. As the ex-leper says in Monty Python, alms for an ex-leper, not so much as a by your leave, he heals me, and so on. That's that explanation of why people are jumping into the pool in a race wasn't in earliest manuscripts. The idea that it was an angel that came to make it bubble up. Some scribe must have written in the margin this little marginal note in case people weren't familiar with the thing. Well, this is what they're talking about. But when that copy wears out and another scribe makes a new copy, he sees the thing in the margin and says, oh boy, my predecessor skipped this accidentally. I'll put it back where it belongs. And there's another one in 1 Corinthians 14 and so on. So there are a few places that they will accept interpolations, though there's got to be manuscript evidence. Well, what about those decades where there's no manuscript evidence? Or you just have to believe it came that way from the hand of the author? Well, we know that the texts are more flexible the further back you go. We can start seeing, comparing them, that people are making this kind of goof or adding that or whatever. But before that, you have to assume they were even more careless. So you'd kind of expect interpolations. Some are just stupid goofs that you'd catch in proofreading. But as Bart himself showed, people were changing the text to help them win theological debates. This great book Bart wrote, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, is all about that. It says, take a look at some of these aberrant readings. They're not just mistakes. Nobody would make this mistake. Somebody is trying to change the text. So, oh yeah, you're wrong. Look at this verse. Oh, okay, let's take a look at it. Hey, where'd it go? So that you have that kind of thing as he shows. So there shouldn't be anything controversial if you can show that it's anomalous, doesn't fit into uh, the logic of the argument. The vocabulary is strikingly different than that we usually find in this author. There's an anachronism, like when Paul seems to be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. God's wrath has come upon the Jews at last. Wait a minute, I thought this was written in the 50s. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70, and what else could he mean? Well, maybe he didn't write that. And so there's a lot of the stuff is not really inherently controversial. It's just theologically inconvenient for some people. The mainstream Society of Biblical Literature scholars are a lot closer to the fundamentalist rock from which they were hewn.
Well, is it possible that it's an interpolation by Paul, or like he wrote it and then he went back and said, "Oop, I'll change this a little bit. This works better like this." Could that be a possibility?
Oh, well, yeah. In fact, I think that's what the Western text of Acts is. There's this there's a couple of manuscripts, one in Greek, one in Latin, Codex Bezae, it's called, because Theodore Beza owned it, where the book of Acts is like 20% longer than it is in all other manuscript traditions. But it all seems to be of a uniform style, and since you can compare it, it looks like there's just some flourishes added here and there, like in the Ethiopian eunuch, the no, Philip, the evangelist, converts the Ethiopian, and it tells him that Isaiah is talking about Jesus in this passage, and he says, "Wow, well, what's stopping me from being baptized right here and now?" And and then he's baptized in the regular text, but in the Western text, Philip says to him, "You may, if you believe that so and so, Jesus Christ is the Son of God," or something. Now, why would he add that? Well, just to tighten up the requirements for baptism. So, to me, a lot of those changes read exactly like what you're saying. Somebody going back, maybe I got to put that a little differently. But with some of these things, why would Paul have put it where he did? Surely he would have been sensitive to the logic of the argument he's pursuing in 1 Corinthians 10. Surely he would have put it between these things, but a lot of ancient readers just were not looking at it that way. They just looked at the Bible as a source of proof texts. And so that's no surprise.
One thing, Bart Ehrman, Matt Dillahunty asked Bart, like, what would it cause to really make a change or an impact in academia to cause them to change their mind? And he said that it would require someone to really start publishing in academia, like the Oxford Press. Have you tried to publish any of your books in like the Oxford Press and those academically peer-reviewed journals?
Well, I had an acquisitions editor from Oxford contact me and ask if I would write something for them. But the ideas I had, they just didn't think would fly. And it wasn't because they were controversial. One of them it's been a few years now. It wasn't because it was mythicist. I don't quite remember. Philip Davies sadly passed away a year or so ago. He knew where I stood on all this stuff, and I'd sent him an outline of a book, a couple of books I am still working on, one called Judaizing Jesus, where I argued that the orthodoxy of today that insists Jesus was basically a rabbinic Jew is really just a theological construct for the sake of Jewish Christian ecumenical dialogue. And I was going to try to show that this really isn't supported by a critical look at the Gospels. The other one was called Christ Mythicism and Gospel Christology, addressing the question of if Jesus did start as a myth and got historicized, how come from one gospel to the next, it appears that he's more of a human prophet and gets elevated to godhood? Shouldn't it have been the reverse? And I try to explain why this happened. Well, Davies said he was one of the judges, editorial judges, whatever, for Sheffield Academic Press, which is pretty prestigious. And he said he'd be willing to help get it published. He didn't find it substandard. Morris Casey also sadly died a couple of years ago. He did a book slamming mythicists. He was really nasty and sarcastic. Well, I just couldn't wait to hear what he'd say about me, and he was pretty soft on me because I had the credentials. Of the other ones, he would refer to blogger so and so and just ridicule him. But I guess he couldn't say that much bad about me. And this is this thing about you got to get published in these respectable venues, or another thing they say similarly, you have to represent some elite academic institution. Bart also makes no bones about the fact that if a mythicist applied for a teaching position at UNC where he teaches, he'd make sure they didn't get the job because they don't hire lunatics or eccentrics. Well, okay, I guess that's out in the open, but that was pretty obvious anyway. That's not going to happen. So so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They make sure they keep nuts like me out of the halls of academia. I know this sounds like sour grapes, but it's been years since I ever even wanted to join the faculty of a university or a seminary. So I'm happy enough to do what I'm doing with a Bible geek and all of that, and not serve on committees and not be forced to mouth politically correct shibboleths. I hate that stuff. I hate the whole enterprise. That's good for some, but I'm just not that kind of person. So luckily I'm on the sidelines on this. He's not keeping me out, and I'm mad about it. I wouldn't go in if I were invited, but it's no mystery, and he explained why.
Well, that's it's a really interesting position. I would like to see you compete at that level. I want to see what happens when you guys get into really big arguments and debates in an academic setting. That would be interesting for me to watch.
Well, there's a book that InterVarsity Press published called The Historical Jesus 5 Views, where John Dominic Crossan, Darrell Bach, James D.G. Dunn, I forget who the fourth one was, and me, we were all invited to sum up what we thought about the historical Jesus. And mine was called Jesus at the Vanishing Point, and it was a case for mythicism. And then we each were invited to write a critique of all four of the other guys. And to tell you the truth, I've never read what they said about mine, but that might be something to read. That might be worth looking at.
Yeah, that was one of the books suggested to me by one of my friends coming into this conversation. But you said you didn't read the responses. Why not?
No, I just get sick of that. I've been debating on and off for 20 years. I just realized the other day it's profitless. I know what they're going to say, and when I do hear it or read it, I turned out to be right. It's just you can't spend, if you're trying to do something of a pioneering nature, you can't let engagement with the traditionalists slow you down. I'm very, very familiar with what all of these people say. None of it surprises me anymore. I've been doing this research for over 40 years, ever since I was in, I guess, a freshman in college. And I just can only stand so much of it. By the way, I'm not trying to vilify these people. I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting them. I was in the Jesus seminar for a long time, and those were great people. Bart is a fine fella. I enjoy his friendship. It's just that it's a great sport to kick these issues around.
So, one final question, since we've been going for a little over almost an hour and a half now. What do you think are the strongest criticisms of the mysticist position?
I think this may sound weirdly marginal, but the thing that I think is the strongest argument, and it's not decisive, is what Adolf Harnack and Ethelbert Stauffer pointed out many decades ago, that from these little statements in church fathers, it seems that there was what one of them called the Caliphate of James, that the list of brothers of Jesus given in Mark 6, I think, Joses, James, Judas, and Simon or Simeon, that these guys, after Jesus was gone, were a succession of substitutes, which is what caliph means. Like the Muslims use it as an official title, but this would have been the same sort of thing. So James the Just is the leader of the Jerusalem church, even in Acts. I mean, when they have the Apostolic Council in chapter 15, they don't vote on it. He listens to both sides and says, okay, here's what we're going to do. Well, we're told that he was a martyr, that he was so Jewish that the Sanhedrin didn't even realize he was a Christian. And when they called upon him to state his beliefs, they were shocked and had him stoned to death. And then we're told that Simeon Bar Cleophas, another brother of Jesus, took over as the head of the Jerusalem church. And then presumably after that, other ones did, but we don't have a whole lot of information. But why would there have been a kind of canonical list of the brothers of Jesus unless it was a succession list originally? And I thought, well, that is certainly plausible. The Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints took that route. The successor to Joseph Smith had to be his son, and so on down the line. Whereas the regular old LDS Church said, no, our leaders are chosen from the quorum of apostles that Smith appointed. So there you had the same parting of the ways. And there are other examples of that. The Nation of Islam, the son of Elijah Muhammad, took over, but then Louis Farrakhan was more of a traditionalist and said, no, I'm his disciple, you better follow me. I mean, this is the kind of sectarian dynamic. And this fits the principle of analogy so well. I said, now this certainly implies that these people thought Jesus was a man who had brothers. It's just that that isn't decisive, because people used to make up in the Bible all the time fictive genealogies as authority claims. Like, how do we know that Jacob had 12 sons, each of whom was a patriarch of a different tribe? Well, in all probability, the 12 tribes of Israel was a confederation of 12 originally separate groups. There are plenty of these in the Mediterranean world, Roman, Greek, Middle Eastern, and all that. There would be 12 tribes because each tribe took a turn maintaining a central cult site, an altar or a temple or whatever. And so there'd be 12, and to seal the deal, they would fictively claim, we are all descended from the sons of one man. That makes us blood brothers. And or in with John the Baptist, you don't hear anything about Jesus being related to John until Luke, because Luke has this agenda of paralleling figures that he wants, whose followers he wants to reconcile. He does that in Acts with Peter and Paul. Does the same thing in Luke with Jesus and John the Baptist, and to seal the deal, he has John suddenly be a cousin of Jesus. Why didn't we hear that before? I mean, he doesn't even, he's not even said to know who Jesus is in the other one. So there's reason to believe that these connections may have been later fictions. And in this case, if James, as Robert Eisenman says, was the teacher of righteousness at Qumran, and I think he makes a real good case for it. Well, somebody wanted to get those groups to join together, them and the Jerusalem church, and so they, well, you know, they're brothers, and so that's also a strong historical analogy. So I don't think there are really any strong arguments decisive against mythicism, but it's all pretty vague. I mean, there's no real decisive arguments for any of this stuff.
Were there any extra biblical accounts of the followers of Jesus, like James and the linealogy you mentioned about the successors? Were there any extra biblical accounts of them existing independent of the Bible?
Well, if Josephus is referring to James and Jesus, there's a story where he says that James was martyred, and this James was the brother of Jesus, called the Christ. Well, people love to say, "Well, there you go. He's writing pretty close to the events." Well, not that close, actually. Some 60 years after what happened, I guess. But as Richard Carrier's pointed out, I think there's a pretty strong argument that Josephus isn't talking about them. He's talking about a different incident where a guy named James, the son of Damnaeus, was supposed to be the next high priest, but the house of Annas, or Ananus, they have both names in it, I forget which was which, didn't like that, and his line had been high priest for quite a while, and he wanted to pass to somebody else, so he arranged for James to be murdered, assassinated. A lot of Jews didn't like this and he was able to get away with this because they were between procurators. One had been recalled, another one was on the way. And other Jews said to the new guy, "Hey, look at this. You're not going to let this go on, are you?" And he says, "No, I'm not." And so he kicked out Ananus and said, "Let's let it go to James's brother, Jesus, son of Damnius," because every other guy was named Jacob or Joshua, and I think Carrier really takes the cake on that one, and if so, that's off the table. Hegesippus, a second-century Jewish Christian historian whose works survive only in quoted fragments, has a longer, more elaborate story about James being stoned to death by the Sanhedrin. And that's often taken to be another version of the Josephus thing. It might be a fictitious expansion of it. No way to know, but I think that's about it. Somebody mentions that Simeon Bar Cleophas, like James the Just, lived to be about 120 years old, whatever it was that Moses, I think of Moses was 120 supposedly, but I believe that's it. There are apocryphal stories of the apostles, but we really know nothing about any of them. A lot of what we think we know is derived from apocryphal gospels that are just completely legendary otherwise. So we know much. I mean, the lists of their names don't even agree in the gospels. So we know a lot less than some people take for granted.
Well, I would still consider that to be a lot more than what we know about most of the people during the time. So even those
Yeah.
moderate accounts still seem to be strong evidence that James existed in that sense. It could, of course, be referring to a different James, but that still is evidence in the direction that he could have existed.
Oh, well, yeah, yeah. I'm just saying this is another pain in the neck reason why I find it increasingly hard to come to any particular conclusion. It's so old and the evidence is so fragmentary and equivocal. You cannot just assume, okay, there was no Jesus, or there was, but he was Clark Kent, or he was just like they told me in Sunday school. Good luck. Any one of these things is a chain of weak links.
Oh, I totally agree with you on that point. I just tend to lean towards the Jesus was a Clark Kent kind of character with a
Yeah,
small
yeah,
degree, a
sure.
little bit more than anything else, like a 51% kind of a thing.
Could be.
Well, anyway, thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed our conversation. You
Oh,
answered
me
pretty
too.
much most of my questions I had for you, so I really
Okay,
appreciate it.
well, thanks for having me. Great to meet you.
Absolutely. Talk to you later. Bye.
Okay.